What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, which is, I would say, a historically important game, if not one you would maybe want to actually play for a variety of reasons that we'll get into. But as I mentioned not all that long ago, I have intended to review this game for a while, as obviously the franchise it is part of is a big deal, yes, but also I'm just extremely interested in older important games, and Redguard's got that in spades, and so I figured I would make this video talking about a few things before I put out the full review probably in a few days. Now, I have played Redguard before. This is not my first time with it, and in doing so, I know a few things about it. I actually own it in two places, both on Steam and GOG. But to kick it off, while this game is not going to run incredibly well for anybody anywhere these days, you do probably want the GOG version. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. It uses a different graphics renderer, which is going to be easier on your system overall. But before we dive too much farther, I do want to mention that if you ever find yourself wanting to play Redguard, there are basically two big things I would say that are something you should know. One, the story is surprisingly good. Like, it's probably the reason you would play this game, to be honest. But the other thing is really just that this game has a lot of problems. It is not a great gameplay experience. Between the things that are bugs and the things that are not bugs but are just not fun to actually do, it's probably no small wonder then that between this game and Battlespire both being commercial flops, that Bethesda was in a lot of trouble before they wound up putting out Morrowind a couple of years later. Redguard released in '98 in North America and '99 over in Europe, and the rest, of course, is history. But the history is really the interesting part to me personally, because as you can surely see on screen, this is one of those very, very early 3D titles where they were still trying to sort of figure all of that out, which could certainly be said of many games in the 90s, but that's relevant here for getting it to run. As I mentioned, the GOG and Steam versions each use a different renderer. If you had bought this game physically back then, when you installed it, you would actually get a choice between the two. Obviously, games preservation being what it is, these days you have to pick one or the other. Generally, the GOG version is going to be better because it allows it to be played at a higher resolution, which is going to be better on modern day monitors, and it also is just generally less prone to the issues that are going to pop up, but with luck you should see them a little bit less. In fact, if this winds up taking me any longer than a couple of days, it will likely be because I ran into some catastrophic issue, of which there are a few. It is possible to fall into a void and you just sort of fall endlessly, which is obviously a bit of a showstopper. There is a situation where if you play long enough in a certain way, certain areas of the game will just stop loading, which has a couple of workarounds, neither of which are super fun. And all of that is before you even start talking about the game's very, very clunky gameplay. The controls are probably something you'll notice right away. It is possible to rebind the movement keys, which default to arrows and the use button and everything, but what that absolutely will not fix is the fact that when your character starts and stops moving is anybody's guess. There are times where you'll stop on a dime, and there's times where your character continues moving forward when you've stopped for like a good 2 seconds, which makes things like some of the game's early platforming difficult, to say the least, and that's before you start getting into like the rope swing puzzles that come later. But there is a little bit of good news. So outside of a team working to put this game together in Unity, just like they did for Daggerfall, or at least in a similar fashion, I should say, which should make it more accessible for everybody else, in the meantime, there are console commands with this, as old as it is, and there are a handful of those commands that can help you out of a given situation, which might be rough, such as, for instance, teleporting to a location, which can help you bypass some issues here and there, allowing your character to fly more or less, or even move through certain surfaces to get around some of the issues I already mentioned. So if you run into any of these problems, there are potential fixes. Now, this is also a very old game that came with a manual that you would have been expected to read before playing it, which would be useful for knowing things like what the potions or items do, because there is no description for those things, and these days you will have had to have just looked it up, really. But what is the reward at the end of all this suffering? Well, the answer is, again, that surprisingly good story. So while the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard doesn't have you just playing any old Redguard, we are in fact playing Cyrus on a hunt for his sister after receiving a letter that she's been missing for some time via your crime boss Sarathra. You find yourself on the island of Stros Makai in Hammerfell looking for her a short while after the Tiber Wars here have taken place, when Tiber Septim was sweeping across the continent. And in searching for your sister, you find yourself neck deep in a significant amount of political intrigue, as well as, of course, esoteric and arcane plots which deal with elements of the lore that don't see a ton of play, but perhaps more recently a little more. Like, for instance, the Slode. We get an encounter with one named Nagasta, who in that race has really only been seen in ESO since then. But perhaps mercifully, given the nature of all the bugs and everything, the game is not particularly long, so it is possible to run through this in 20-ish hours, give or take, and that will allow you to experience what's good about the game with hopefully not having to suffer through all the problems too much. However, since the game is relatively simple otherwise, there's not too much to report on the gameplay side of things, outside of your ability to combine items in a lot of cases, to get a little bit of crafting done, making yourself some better healing items. You're mostly going to run around the small island of Stros Makai, which has been present in other games since then, and you should know from those, if you've played them, that it's not a particularly big little island. And so you basically just run around the small hub area, which is going to allow you to go into different shops, spend any gold you've acquired, while also talking and asking a bunch of questions of the native citizens. Now, believe it or not, the dialogue system is visually a little different, but functionally very similar to what Morrowind did, where you'll talk to individuals and that will prompt more keywords to pop up in the dialogue options, if you will, that you can then ask them about. And I will say that there is a surprising amount of dialogue for each individual characters if you've never have played this game before. There is a decent amount of exposition here, which I think if anything goes to show the amount of thought that was put into the story that was actually being told. But it's hardly like it's perfect on that front either, unfortunately. So with the game's age, there's unsurprisingly things like issues with the audio and exact cues, but also I would say the structure of how the game sets you up for success. For instance, one of the earliest quests you'll be given right as you step off the boat in the harbor is likely from a guy named Kotaro, who puts you on the trail of Ngasta to get an audience with the provisional governor, who is on the side of the Empire, and as the game describes it, a bit of an a-hole. The thing is, if you follow through with that quest and do it early on in the game, it turns all of the guards in town hostile, and combat in this game is pretty terrible, to be honest. It's supposed to be like a visual thing where you wait for enemies to drop their guard and then you use your attacks while you try to defend, but really what it winds up is more of just spamming attacks at enemies, kind of mindlessly flailing because it lacks, I would say, the graphical fidelity to lean on the visual cues that it wants to. But anyway, you can get all of the port guards, and they're everywhere by the way, to turn hostile on you very, very early if you don't know to hold off on that quest for a little bit. And that, combined with all the bugs and everything, just makes for a miserable experience if you go into this and you're not prepared for it. And I guess when you put all of those things in perspective, it's not exactly a big surprise that this game didn't do super well. But nonetheless, a simply interesting title for its historical place in the world. Now, I do think that is pretty much all I want to say until it is roughly time to review this title again. This will likely only take me a couple of days unless I run into a nastier set of the potential bugs, which will obviously slow me down a little, but provided everything goes smoothly, it won't take long, and I'll use the review to dive into the specifics of the story, since let's be real, a lot of people are not playing this, and talking more about the island and the presentation and all that stuff. But hopefully you're looking forward to all of that. If nothing else, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to chime in about anything Redguard or Elder Scrolls related, certainly feel free to do so down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.